We are undertaking a peak oil risk assessment and response plan report. We have a number of advanced students involved in preparing this report, members of the faculty from various secondary schools and institutes, and an external consultant as well to help us bring it all together. So that's going to be due at the end of July, so we're looking forward to that to add to the debate in the broader Tasmanian community on peak oil impacts. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Chris, and then it'll come back to me, and I'm going to have you all stand up and stretch and move around a little bit and come down closer for the Q&A.
Thank you, Hugh. It just occurred to me while Nicole was talking that we didn't hear the word climate change at all. And that's the third hurdle, but for many people in the world it's the first hurdle. So let's not forget, we've got many challenges. At this point I'd really like to take every single person aside and ask, what does this make you feel personally? I mean, do you feel overwhelmed? Do you feel depressed? Do you feel, let's get into it, what? And a lot of people have been trying to get their heads around these issues for quite a long time. So I represent a small group of people from Nicole, Tasmania. A lot of links with the financial situation, and quite a lot of cross links with the climate change issue. I know that in this room there are people who have been working on a lot of tremendous initiatives, big change people working on sustainable transport, people working on sustainable and livable cities, solar rooftop programs, home energy saving, local food production, and sustainable communities. And as Nicole was saying, when we look at all these good little things we're doing, we can liken that to the animals crossing the river with the crocodiles. We can't make it just by doing these individual things we've already put together. So I'm getting to the point that as a larger community, there are lots of people in Tasmania who are galvanising together, galvanising their efforts, and creating what we're calling is the transition movement, transition towns, transition communities, whatever you like to call it. There have been a number of sustainable communities developed over the last few years in a very germinal state. We haven't got into anywhere near the complexity of what Nicole has been advising us tonight, but we have been working on a range of initiatives which, when it boils down to it, we're recognising that we need to become much more codependent. And so there are ways of doing that. I'm just wondering, when you came in, there's a little, we don't believe in wasting paper, there's a little calling card for people who would like to follow up this discussion next week. When Australians are faced with a heavy burden, they go to the party, and we're inviting you to the New Sydney Hotel on the 22nd of March, where people who are interested in following up and finding out a bit more are able to, because there's not a lot of opportunity tonight to be able to do that. The second thing we'd like to do is, out in the foyer, there are the still-in sheets, just to put your name, postcode and email address. Peacock Tasmania has been running a number of events in the last few years, including a couple of significant workshops on the domain, and we have collected a number of contacts at that point, and some of those people will be here. If you want to remain connected, we don't overburden you with information only once in a few weeks. You will receive a bit of information from us about events coming up and so forth. But when you do fill this out, slow down to half speed when you put your email address down. There's nothing worse than having a whole heap of email addresses readable, and from which you would never get a reply from us, and we wondering why. And the third thing is that little calling card on your seat has got the web address for Peacock Tasmania. We try to update it with whatever you can. We'll certainly be following up with a summary of today's event. And other issues such as the state government's imminent release of its oil vulnerability study. We believe it's due to be released in the next fortnight. So if you want to keep in touch with all those things that may be happening in the future, please do link to the website, make it a favourite of what we do, and keep in touch with us. Thank you.
You mentioned a number of things with crashing. You said oil, and you also mentioned the passing gold. And on the other hand, you said we need to learn from the Great Depression, and you pointed out that during the Great Depression, comic books and entertainment did well. Well, I might add that during the Great Depression, one of the few stocks that did well were things like mining, which were up like 600%, and that gold got revalued upward something like 70% by Roosevelt. So, although I agree with you about the deflation, I don't agree that gold will necessarily go down in price very long.
Well, gold is complicated. So I didn't end up discussing it in the talk like I have done other times, simply because it takes me rather a long time to paint the full picture. Basically, we've had a parabolic rise up to some $1,900 an ounce.
Yeah, but compared to 1980, in terms of inflation, it's not even made as high.
But the point is that anything that does this is going to come down. And what you end up with, in fact, is we have a massive Ponzi scheme in paper gold. That's really where the fall comes. Paper gold goes to nothing. The real gold will hold its value, and it will do it over the long term. I do expect the spot price to fall a long way, probably down to, say, $600 an ounce. But $600 an ounce in a deflationary period is an awful lot of money. So it's not that I'm saying gold will not hold value, but the spot price will fall, which means that people who bought it at today's price may find they would have been better off holding the cash because there's a long fall that is coming. The main point is that unless you can hold it for the long term, say sit on it for 20 years without having to rely on the value it represents in the meantime, then if you end up being forced to sell because you're hungry or you have debt to service, and you end up in a situation where you bought gold, but you were still vulnerable in other ways. You still have debt, you don't have any money, you don't have any control of the essentials of your own existence, and you're hungry. You have no bargaining power under those circumstances. There are too many people who are buying gold who are going to be forced to sell it into the ultimate buyer's market, and they're going to get next to nothing for it. They would have been much better off holding the cash. So it depends who you are as to whether it makes sense. If you can make a genuinely long-term investment, it will absolutely hold its value over the long term. It has for thousands of years. I'm not going to bet against that track record. But it's really only, you can only take advantage of the long-term situation if you can hold it for the long term. If you can, it's a great insurance policy. Now, it probably will be declared illegal to own at some point, as it was in the 1930s. That doesn't stop you owning it if you're creative enough, but it does make it very difficult to trade it for other things you might happen to want. So again, you don't want to be in a position where you would have to do that anytime soon. So, and you also have to be pretty creative with how you look after it as well. You don't want it to be in the grip of the system, if you like. You don't want to be separated from it. But if you're holding it yourself, well, there are some obvious risks to do with that. So it's simply not a panacea the way a lot of people are imagining. You know, if you're trying to trade in something that's illegal to own, well, you're dealing with black markets. These are not nice people. They want to follow you home to see if there's any more where that came from. So there are a whole lot of risks that people are not really thinking about. In fact, if you look in, say, farmers' fields in places like the UK, people still find today stashes of Roman coins that obviously didn't do their owners very much good because they're still there 2,000 years later. So it really depends. Yes, you can preserve long-term value this way, but it's not for everybody, depending on what else your circumstances are. And also being very close to an extremely concentrated source of wealth can be as dangerous as being too close to the center of power because everybody wants what you have. So be careful. Silver may be better than gold in some ways. It won't hold its value as well because more of its value depends on its industrial uses. But at the same time, you may not have to go through cash to use it because it's less concentrated. It might at some point be possible to use silver directly. So it's less dangerous to own something that's not as concentrated a source of value. So it's swings and roundabouts in many ways, but it's a question of what can you genuinely afford to own? Are you going to be able to take advantage of it as a long-term insurance policy?
My name's Ian Kramer. Okay. I can follow your scenario, and I think it's very plausible. But I do this in the knowledge also that China's got trillions of spare cash that they could even afford to bail out Europe if it chooses to. BHP have these billions of dollars worth of plans that they're going to build in the near future, same as Rio. Now, they would have all this expertise that I presume has been sort of given around here tonight. So why are they doing this in the knowledge, presumably, that we are going to fall down the river in the near future?
Well, so there's two separate parts to that. There's the China part and the mining part. China is sitting on an awful lot of money at a state level, and what they're doing is buying up assets all over the world with it. So they are buying assets and not just settling for ownership, they're also establishing de facto control. So they're sending their people there, they're colonizing places like Africa. And yes, that dynamic's been underway for a long time. They are the empire in the ascendancy, and that's what empires in the ascendancy always do. So from the Chinese perspective, I regard what's coming as the setback at the dawn of the Chinese century in the way that the Great Depression was the setback at the dawn of the American century. Now, I think it's going to be very painful. A lot of China is environmentally ruined, and they have this tremendous gender disparity that is 100% predictor of conflict somewhere. It gives you a standing army with nothing else to do. So no economic opportunities for a period of time, no prospects for settling down and being productive. So if you look at what happens under those circumstances, what has happened in various places where there's an excess of unemployable young men, they get sent to cause trouble somewhere else, typically. So I think that's very much on the cards, and that's going to be a major danger factor going forward. So I think China, in the longer term, will end up being the most significant power in a much more multipolar world, but I don't think they'll be quite a superpower in the way that America was, because there won't be the energy to project power at a distance in that same way. So being the most significant power doesn't necessarily mean achieving the heights that America achieved in the American century, but it will still mean a lot in relative terms, relative to an awful lot of other parts of the world. So I don't look at China's long-term prospects as being especially bleak, but I do think they have a very, very significant setback coming. And a lot of parts of the world are going to look a lot more Chinese than they do today, I think, because migration is absolutely inevitable. A lot of places are going to look a lot more Indian as well. I mean, there are an awful lot of people in places that won't be able to support the number of people that live there now. So I think they're going to spread. Now, on the mining perspective, basically there's a large bubble in the commodity sector. So people are making plans to exploit that, because right now you can make a lot of money in the short term by doing that. It doesn't matter from the perspective of the people who are making these decisions. They're making the money now, whether or not the investments ever actually get built or ever actually play out. I see this all the time in the States with regard to shale gas, for instance. People are saying, oh, there's so much of it, we're all going to be fabulously wealthy. And what they're doing is talking up the value of land leases so they can flip them for a lot of extra money. So if you create enough hype over something, then you can create the perception of value that allows you to profit enormously in the short term, and then simply walk away if you have to. So this is a real estate bubble in another form, if you like. And I think there's a lot of that going on in mining here too. And it's interesting that if you look at what the insiders in the shale gas industry are saying to each other, they're laughing up their sleeves and saying, oh, we know there's never going to be any real gas produced here, but someone will pay 10 times what we did. So they know perfectly well this is a Ponzi scheme, but they're just pumping the hype, because that's the way to make a lot of money right now. Now, I don't think a lot of these prospective investments are ever actually going to come to fruition, because if the prices start to fall, who is going to pump in a lot of investment for a long-term project when the prices are coming down, when the demand is drying up? I don't think it's going to happen. But the people who are pumping them will have made their money and run long before then, so from their point of view, it's not a problem. But I don't think many of these projects will be built. And I think some of the projects that have been built will not be successful because there won't be the profits that people were counting on. And then if you don't get the profit stream you were counting on, you can't necessarily service the debt you took on to finance the project. So projects end up going into receivership, being taken over by someone else who may or may not be able to make a go of it if the financing costs have been eliminated. So it's actually quite a complex situation. I think in the longer term, there will still be mining here. I think a lot of the very simple stuff, like strip mining coal and things, which has a reasonably high net energy, I think a lot of that will continue. And if oil gets scarce, they may well do coal to liquids here at some point. You know, horrendous environmental consequences be damned. If one is short of energy, that's exactly what ends up happening, assuming it can be afforded. And at some point it might be high enough priority that it would be. So you end up with oil issues here sooner than you end up with energy issues in general. So I do think there will be mining here, and people will take a lot of the demand that's currently satisfied by oil and attempt to satisfy it with coal or possibly natural gas if you can repudiate the contracts for selling LNG to far-flung places, which probably does happen at some point in the future. So mining will continue, but I think a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money who have bet on mining over the next, say, decade or so. I think it's a longer term bet than that, but a lot of people who are betting on imminent scarcity now, who are betting on the commodity bubble at a point where it's peaking, are going to find that they lose a lot of money in the short term, even if over the longer term they're right about energy being scarce. You can go through a period where it isn't, and it's very difficult to make a profit in that sector. And you know, if you can't hang on for the long term, it's like with gold. If you can't hang on to the long-term bet for the long term, you lose an awful lot of money in the short term. So I think it's very much a qualified sense of something that one should be doing. I would say one should not be investing in that right now. In the longer term, it will be a much better bet.
Just over here.
Nicole, my name's Peter Boyle. I was relieved that you did introduce the community element at the end of your talk, because it was looking a little like the survival kind of mode earlier on. So thank you for that, and thank you for a wonderful exposition. Chris was pointing out that transition is a movement in Australia that's, well, it's beginning, and it's still in very, very early days, and it's still, as Chris said, very germinal. But I was wondering if you could talk a little about this movement or an equivalent in North America.
The transition towns movement is wonderful. It's getting a grip everywhere. And in fact, about half of the speaking engagements I do come through transition towns worldwide. Canada, the US, all over Europe. At least half of the initiatives here, at least half of the speaking engagements I've here have their roots in the transition towns movement. So it's about planning now for a transition to, well, it was originally a lower energy future with less impact on the climate, but I've been trying to convince them loudly that they really need to bear economics in mind as well, because if your plans are only about energy and you know nothing about finance, you end up losing all your freedom of action, and there's nothing you can do about the things that are longer term. Plus, if people think that energy in, say, 10 years will be the problem, they don't do anything right now. So they just talk too much and they don't actually do anything. Whereas if they understand what's happening in the world of finance, they get far more motivated and they actually start the planning process and really putting things into action. So it's all about planning now while we have the luxury of the long-term view, and we're not hungry or anything like that. Being able to create plans for how we get from where we are now to where we are going. So basically, we're going over a cliff, whether we like it or not. Transition towns is a bit like saying, well, we realize we're going over a cliff. How about we put on a parachute and jump, rather than stand on the edge and wait for someone to shove us off? The consequences when you get to the bottom are really very different under those two circumstances. So that's what it amounts to. It's how do we get there as painlessly as possible? And it's not an easy process. For most people, it involves, for a period of time at least, all the work of two different worlds, having a foot in two different worlds, and not really all benefits of either one. But it's a question of making the transition from where we are to where we're going. And I think life will be. And I have tremendous respect for Rob Hopkins. I know him personally, and I've spoken at their conference and things in England. So North America is really taking off, especially in the States. In Canada, in just a few places, depends. There's not much in the middle. The tar sands area, all Alberta, is very much like, say, Western Australia, where we have mining. Why would we worry? So that kind of attitude in places like Alberta really means nobody is doing anything. But they are on the West Coast, they are in Ontario. In the States, there are transition town initiatives everywhere. So almost all the speaking engagements I do in the States are transition towns groups and community groups, very much like that. They're really building up an organizational structure nationally as well. So there's a Transition Voice magazine that they run in the States. And the movement's only been there for 4 years or something like that. It's not very long, but it's got a tremendous amount of traction in a short period of time. So I'm very pleased to see it developing here too. I think Rob Hopkins can be genuinely proud of what he's created.
I want to just do a follow-up to that. You talked about cash and cash equivalents and all of that. Part of the transition towns often is a relocalization of currency. Do you just reflect which cash are we talking about?
Well, principally, it's what I was talking about in the lecture was preserving what counts as cash today. So basically extracting assets from being at risk of the solvency of middlemen. So getting hold of actual cash, actual physical cash under your own control, a certain amount of it. Not a staggeringly large amount. There are obviously risks to do that. But enough so that if there's a bank holiday, you wouldn't be hungry anytime soon. You would still be able to keep functioning for a period of a few months, perhaps a year. But I think local currencies that transition talks about, those are completely separate, parallel currencies. And those have been very important at certain times in the past. But they also don't tend to last for very long once they become effective. So again, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think it's very much worth doing anyway. But if you look at the experience of, say, Austria in the 1930s, they had a particularly well-studied example in Würzburg, where they had a tremendously successful local currency. You could pay your local taxes in it and everything. It really got a tremendous amount of traction. There was tons of economic activity going on there when there was nothing anywhere around. The central government shut it down because it was a threat to the system. So it was a decentralized initiative. There was a lot of economic activity going on, no taxes, no cut was going to the central authorities. So they shut it down and the whole thing went into deep freeze again. But I would say if you're going to put in a local currency, think of it in terms of living on borrowed time, because you have to understand it's a threat. And at some point, if it becomes successful enough, somebody's going to decide that it shouldn't exist anymore. But if in the meantime, what you have managed to do is to build relationships of trust, then those are the actual currency that matters. So if during the period of time that it lasts, you've got to the point where you know the people involved well enough that you're simply prepared to have a gift economy, barter, swap things with them, and you trust them. Well, if I help you today, you'll help me tomorrow if I need it. Once you get to that level of trust, then things can function even if you don't have the currency anymore. Because the currency is really only a marker. Same thing with time banking, where you're keeping track of hours exchanged for hours. These are a means of scaling something up. So in a situation where you don't initially have everybody involved trusting each other, you keep track, you keep a tally, because you think, well, if I help someone today, maybe they won't help me tomorrow. So we'll just keep track, and we'll have a ledger, and then we'll have some predictability to the system. So you have your time bank or your local currency, and you scale things up. But if you're also scaling up trust, if the local currency or the time bank goes away, the system can still function. And that's really what the aim needs to be. So if people are doing it thinking, we're living on borrowed time here, but what can we build in terms of trust, in terms of social capital and social infrastructure, and community infrastructure of all kinds? What can we do in the time we have available? And that gives you a real sense of urgency to just get out there and do it while it's there. and then transition to something that's a lot less formal but a lot more trust-based over time.
Hi, my name's Penelope Ann, and although I agree with you that change is not likely to come from the top, I'm standing for the Legislative Council because I also feel that if we're not careful about who's in government, then some of the problems you talked about are only too likely to happen. My particular concern at the moment is, and I'm not sure that all Tasmanians are aware of it, is that our train system's about to be stopped at Brighton, which means that we will no longer have a train that takes goods or passengers or any possibility of it in the future.
Where is Brighton?
Brighton is
Other
on
than
the
in Southern
eastern
England?
shore. It's an outer suburb, but it's on the eastern shore of the river. At the moment there is a bridge at Bridgewater, but the new plans do not include a new rail bridge. And as of September, they're going to stop bringing goods trains into Hobart. They already, we haven't had passenger trains here since the 70s, but, with peak oil, one would assume that rail would become an essential service.
Are they proposing to dig up the track?
No,
Or just cancel the services?
The state government prefers to put a fast bus on the existing track if they ever need or plan to do any other public transport, which means that probably, yes, it will be rendered.
Yeah, digging up the track would be the dangerous thing. Provided you can go back to it if you need it, then it's not as dangerous.
No,
So,
the version of the bridge is.
yes, I mean, if you were to lose the bridge and lose the infrastructure, especially if you were to lose the right-of-way, that would be the really situation where there's no way back, or no remotely easy way back. So if the right-of-ways are maintained and at least some of the infrastructure is there, it could be rebuilt at a later stage. Now, I think for the time being, governments may not see it as important, but they may come to see it as important again quite quickly. And if the infrastructure is still there, the service can be revived. Now, on your point about running for the legislature, I think it is useful for some people to do that. So there are certain issues that are really quite important to fight, like fracking, for instance, in various places. Say in New South Wales, there's an absolute epidemic of people proposing to frack for coal seam methane. And in a country that has as little water as Australia, you can't afford to risk any of it. So I think fracking is fundamentally a ridiculous thing for people to be doing here, and it certainly would help to try and fight that at a reasonably high level. Really, it's a question of not putting all one's eggs in the top-down basket as a society. So if we're only trying to change policy from the top down, then we're quite likely beating our heads against a brick wall, and that not a whole lot of things will change. Some people, it's very useful for some people to take that on, especially to make the debate public wherever they possibly can and get people engaged from the grassroots in the issues that genuinely matter. I think that is very much a battle worth fighting. But I would also encourage a lot of people to take grassroots action, because it's really the small scale things that build up that create real change. So things don't have to stay small. They start from the ground up. They start small, but they can grow to wherever the trust will support them. So I think if we can be doing that, we can focus a lot of energy on that kind of grassroots transformation, then we will ultimately have a much bigger effect on society and the transition period, how we get from here to where we're going. I think we will see much more impact of people's efforts if they concentrate at that level. But I think it would also be very useful for at least some people to take the fight to a higher level and to publicize the issues rather than allow people to be walked all over and to simply have people ignorant of the things that genuinely matter.
Thank you for the talk. But really, following on from that question, I understand your scepticism about government, but if you step back, what are the positive things that a central or state government could do in the unlikely event that sensible people were in charge?
Well, they could institute a rationing system for scarce resources. And they could do things like print food stamps and things like that. If you don't have any money in the system, and therefore you can't connect buyers and sellers, an awful lot of people are going to get very uncomfortable very quickly. So it would certainly be useful to have an alternative system. It would amount to a kind of alternative currency at perhaps a state or a regional level. So things like that could make a genuine difference, because you basically you don't have a revolution if people are not immediately in a state where they're very, very hungry. So there are programs that you can introduce. Some of them take a while, and so it would be actually quite a good idea for them to be thinking about having something available that they could roll out if necessary, waiting in the wings. And I look at what's happening in Europe, and it wouldn't surprise me one little bit if people were printing up new Deutschmarks or new Drachmas or something like that, because I think they know it's inevitable, and the transition would be a lot more chaotic if they hadn't done any preparation in advance. So Germans being Germans, I would absolutely be expecting them to be doing this. And if other governments were really thinking in terms of what could they roll out that might make a difference, something like food stamps would be right up there. I mean, at least in Australia, you don't have to think about reissuing your currency for a different one. So it's not like you have to start printing up new or whatevers. But something like a food stamp program, or some broader program of rationing like they had in, say, the UK in the Second World War, would be something, arguably, that would be very useful to be able to fall back on. But if we don't do it in advance, and we wait for things to get difficult, it will be very, very much harder to implement when people are not in a constructive frame of mind, shall we say. So there are things that can be done. Whether they will be done in a way that is in time to stave off the worst effects is more of a question in my mind. All too often, the job of politicians seems to be to make a bad situation worse as expensively as possible.
Stuart Godfrey. Only a year or two ago, one felt kind of lonely holding the views that you're speaking of. And here we are in a room. It's wonderful to be in a room with as many people as this who think this way. But I'm a bit concerned that there may be a bit of a limit. But there's the people who do think that way, and most of the people just don't. I mean, they are the people who are going to be surprised and upset by it. But one should be trying to think how to bring as many people as possible as default, going beyond the. And it seems to me that one of the things that needs to be done is, as you have done, is to talk about the positives of the internet. And one of the aspects of it that's brand new, that's never been there in any previous thing, is the internet. But what that means is that yes, the shipping will go away, but the communication between peoples all over the world will be there. And when we have a problem with how we do something, we can go to Syria or somewhere that has a similar problem and learn from them. And the end result of it is likely to be a very different world, where there is a sense of a need for a world government, some informal thing. Anyway, I'd just like your views on sort of the broader aspects of what it's going to be like when it all settles down.
Well, my concern about the internet is that it's probably not going to be there in the future in the form that it is now, for a number of reasons. For starters, when you take the money out of the system, people can't necessarily afford internet access or afford hosting fees, so you don't necessarily end up with as much information available or as much access to the information that's available. My main concern with the internet, however, is that it's going to get really inconvenient for the powers that be for ordinary people to be able to talk to each other. So if you look at what happened in the Arab Spring, for instance, in Egypt, the first thing they did is shut down the social media. I mean, you could still do basic communication, especially because at the time, service providers in other countries were saying, by all means for free, use our facilities. The internet at its most basic level was designed to be unkillable. So I think at its most basic level, it probably survives. but not in its sophisticated form today, because that is going to be an acute threat. And the first thing that will happen in a period of acute upheaval is that people's ability to rabble-rouse, for instance, as the powers that be will inevitably see it, will end up being shut down. And I think a lot of independent analysis will end up under attack. So if you look at the legislation they're already trying to pass in the United States, the SOPA and PIPA legislation, it's all, in theory, it's about defending copyright. Well, it's not about defending copyright, it's about getting rid of inconvenient analysis and sharing of information. So they're taking down uploading sites, file sharing sites, in theory on the grounds of copyright, but people's own files are disappearing into a black hole, so they're killing the cloud computing model at the same time. Because people aren't going to trust their files to be out in the cloud if they know that that file sharing site, the whole domain could be taken down, which is what is already happening in the States. And the interesting thing is that the legislation that people were worried about actually didn't pass. But the very week after it didn't pass, the government went out and did it anyway. I mean, they started using the very power people have been most concerned about in the legislation. So basically we don't have the rule of law anymore, and they're just trying to rub that in to say we don't need legislation, we're going to simply go out there and do it, in the same way that they simply rendition people to places where they get tortured or tap people's phones without a warrant and then justify it later, or come up with a legal fix for it after the fact. But if you look at what's going on, especially in the States, where the police state legislation is developing to a really frightening level, and the internet control legislation is coming along as well. And then the impacts in practice, so there's theory is bad enough, in practice it's often worse. That really does worry me. Plus I think there's going to be quite a lot of, it's going to be a bit of a battleground, the internet. I think we've only begun to see the initial skirmishes of cyber war. But if you look at what hackers are capable of doing, and then what governments will be trying to do in return, there's going to be a lot of security breaches, a lot of attacks and counterattacks, and it's going to get to be a much more dangerous place to be trying to exist, I think, than it has been. So right now we have Facebook and things like that, but I don't think the internet will necessarily look like that in the future. So one of the things that I suggest to people is get a hold of all the information you want. Right now, download it, print it out, because if you can't afford to replace your hard drive when it dies, you can't read your flash drive, the information is not accessible anymore. So preserving knowledge is going to be a major challenge. I think we need to try and do that in ways where that knowledge will last us as long as possible. I think that's going to be incredibly important. And if we place all our trust and our reliance on the cloud model, the internet, electronic storage of information, that's very dangerous, because we could lose an awful lot of information in a really short space of time. And we've learned so much, it would be a great shame to simply lose it. There's so much out there right now. If you can get hold of it, you can mine the knowledge base of the world and preserve it in a way that makes a huge difference going forward. And I think that's really, really important.
Good. My name is Frank Kozel. I've just started a degree here at Utah. So I was just wondering if it's still a bad idea to get an education there, even if it's going to help you probably in the future, have a skill that you can use to buy or perhaps.
I think people need to think hard about what they're studying and what value it will have, and try to do it in a way that doesn't take on any more debt than absolutely necessary, and preferably none at all. So there are ways to do this. We're not completely familiar with the kind of tuition levels they have here. In Canada, it would cost $4,000 a year for tuition. and you can probably get half of that in scholarship if you work hard. If you live at home, you don't have to incur the living costs of being away from home. And then you can almost certainly earn a couple of $1,000s extra tuition over the summer with some kind of summer work. So it is possible under those circumstances to graduate with no debt or virtually no debt. So I think people need to think about how they're doing it. If they're saying, oh, but I really want to go and live away from home because it would be fun. But if it's going to cost you $15,000 a year and then you're taking on debt to pay that, you're going to be on the hook for a debt that you don't even have an asset to sell in order to be able to pay off. And if the job market is getting really difficult at that time, then you may find that servicing that debt is really hard. Now, right now, the legislation here is that you don't have to start paying back until you get to a certain level of income. Well, I wouldn't rely on that one. Basically, the rules get changed to suit the powers that be, at their convenience, not yours. So I think leverage over people is something that the powers that be typically like to maintain. So I wouldn't count on not being required to pay that debt back just because there aren't any jobs. And I think that's a difficult situation to be in. So think hard about trying to do it with no debt. Also think about what you're studying and what kind of value it's going to have under what circumstances. So if you're doing something like, something practical, engineering or something like that, then that can have a lot of value going forward. If you're doing film studies, probably not. It really depends how useful it's going to be and what it costs you to get there. Now, the kind of places that worry me more are places like the United States, where it's $50,000 a semester to go to university. They're using students as a giant engine of credit expansion, encouraging them to dig themselves into unbelievable amounts of debt. And basically, they're ending up in a state of debt slavery. So in the States, I basically have to tell people, unless you get a free ride, don't go. It's absolutely not worth it. But in places like here in Canada and Europe, it's simply not like that. It is doable. But think about what it is you're studying and think about how you will use the skills that you're learning, maybe not necessarily in the field that you're learning them in, but how will those skills that you're learning be applicable perhaps in other ways, and just be really careful about not digging yourself into a debt hole in the meantime.
Hi, my name's Susan. I was interested in a comment about student debt as well, and my first really follows on. What are the consequences of having a debt, a large debt to the government for education which you cannot foresee paying off? Going forward, what consequences of that?
It's going to be very, very difficult to predict what the consequences of debt will be, especially debt to the government. My thought is, purely speculating, that they may require some kind of service, direct, non-optional service in return, which starts to look an awful lot like indentured servitude. So there may be ways in which they own you that are not very pleasant, where they get to decide what you're going to do instead of you deciding what you're going to do, at least for a period of time. So it is a dangerous situation to be in. I think less so probably here than in places like the States, where already people are being told, well, look at all the student debt. Here, look at this lovely signing bonus we'll give you if you go and fight our resource wars in Iraq. So they're already twisting the arms of students into serving in the military, whether they want to or not. Private debts are a little harder to, private debts are different, because if you have private debt instead of debt to the government, then what typically happens is that debt gets, if the person you owe the debt to can't collect it, then if they reckon they can't collect it, they may sell the right to collect that debt onto someone else for a price that roughly reflects the risk of not being able to collect it. And that can happen multiple times. And what tends to happen is debt gets sold to more and more aggressive and unscrupulous debt collectors. And eventually you end up with it being sold for 2 cents on the dollar to Vinny the kneecapper or something like that. So there can be significant consequences to debt. But government debt is less predictable because government may simply choose to exercise control over you rather than to try and extract the money. Private debt is more likely to be able to try to extract the money. But it is a dangerous situation to be in. So if there's any way that you can get out from under that debt, it would be wonderful. Now this is where pooling resources comes in too, because as a parent or a grandparent, you might be sitting on a pile of money, superannuation funds or something like that. You might have a big property, you might have cash on hand. You can't take it with you. What better thing can you possibly do with it than rescue your children and your grandchildren from a dangerous situation? And if you pool resources across the generations, they help you get out of debt and you look after them when they're older. There can be quid pro quos there that can allow a whole family to be very, very much more secure collectively than either half could ever hope to be alone. So, but everybody has to be on the same page for that. It's kind of easier said than done, obviously. But I do think doing that kind of thing can make a major difference to an awful lot of people if people are prepared to do that. And both sides would have to accept that there are gains they can give the other party, but there are obligations as well. And that's the way human relationships work. There's a quid pro quo, and that can really, really help. Easier said than done.
Nicole, Peter Dufferin's my name from Signet, and I've been feeling very pleased with myself actually during your talk because I've been ticking a lot of your boxes. I came here about 4 years ago to build a global warming bunker for my kids, but now it has to be global warming and economic, of course. But the thing that worries me is that for all the people who are not in my privileged position, one day they're going to be coming over the hill. And how do you see the people who are not prepared and who are in absolute, dire circumstances? How do you see that playing out?
Less severely here than in a lot of places, because Australia has a moat and Tasmania has a moat. So you're fairly removed from a lot of the places where people could simply walk here. Yes, there might be boat people, but you don't tend to get overrun by boat people in the way that you can get overrun by people who can walk. So I do think a place like this is somewhat remote, and being somewhat remote is useful. Plus, this is a place where you have a reasonably kind climate, and you can grow quite a lot. So I think the longer-term prospects for a place like this are not half bad. Yes, some people will try and move around, but getting to relatively remote places is not necessarily all that simple. So I think places like Europe will have a lot more to worry about when it comes to people marching in, because you can walk there. And it is a graying continent surrounded by very young, vibrant populations that are grossly over-carrying capacity in their own home countries. So I think Europe's going to look an awful lot less European over the next several decades. Here, I think it's simply harder to move around. So I think you will have some migration, but less so. And you're not ridiculously overpopulated for the carrying capacity of this particular part of the earth. I'm told it's about the same size as Ireland, and you have about 1/8 of the population that Ireland has, and Ireland is not grossly overpopulated, so you are even less overpopulated. There's a decent amount of water here, there's a decent amount of land, kind of climate, so the energy requirements are lower. So this is not a bad place to be, and I think you have less to worry about with hordes than many other places. Places in the north of Australia, like Indonesia, might be looking across the straits or Malaysia. So people may try and walk from up north, but it's just simply harder for them to get here. Of course, there will be the issue of not everyone preparing, or not even hardly anybody preparing is most likely. But if we can set examples with what we do in our own lives, especially if we can do it at a community level, then that can provide an obvious example that other people can follow later. It's harder to do it later, but it isn't impossible. So if there's a functioning model around that people can copy, then I think the fabric of society need not be anywhere near as damaged as it otherwise would be. So if we simply live the life that we're trying to lead and lead by example, we can actually affect a lot more than just our own friends and family.
Keith, President, also from Senior Nicole, Peter along with his talk about how we go about tackling this. And to me, your lecture brought out two key elements: trust and flexibility. And our generation has been very neglectful because the up-and-coming generation haven't really been trained in those areas. And we were brought up in times when it was rational and you learned to make do. That gave you flexibility. We were brought up without a lot of luxuries, and our response to that is our kids are going to have everything. And that was bad. I would like to see with this community model, and I agree 100%, it's not going to come from above, it's going to come from below. But I would like to see the idea of community schools where they reinforced ethics and flexibility or common sense.
Well, I agree completely. And I think on the point about raising the next generation, that ideally kids should have everything they need and very little of what they want. Because if they're overly indulged, it just raises their expectations. And then those expectations can't be met. And it's an unkind thing to do to them, because then they end up disappointed with the rest of their lives. And this I think, it sets them up for failure. Whereas if they are taught to be responsible from when they're very young and their expectations are held at a reasonable level, then that really helps them to become people who are going to be the leaders of the future and part of the solution rather than part of the problem. But it is very difficult when you're surrounded by materialism everywhere you look. If you're trying to be different, then your kids are not going to thank you for it in the short term. And one of the things that we did when I moved to Canada, I moved my kids from England to Canada in 2000. Part of the point was to drop them in the country and drastically lower their expectations in a way that there wasn't anybody next door, so that they couldn't just go and do the things that I didn't want them to do, or simply indulge in all sorts of things, because I had complete control over where they went and spent their time. So this was useful, and it did arguably work, but it does take a bit of time to mold them, if you like. And yet community schooling is great, because that's where you teach them the priorities and the values of a particular community. That's where they learn the local knowledge that is what they're going to really need, and what do we have and do not have where we are. National curricula, I think, especially if you do a lot of testing and things, and turn it all into hoop jumping, where you can't measure what's important, so you make important what you can measure, then it all just becomes about going through the motions rather than any kind of real education. So I don't like national curricula, I don't like national testing. I think it's far, far better done at the local level in ways that can teach people to be flexible in the ways that are most appropriate for where they live.
And according to your graphs, we've got about 2030 to do it by.
Well, we just need to start now, and even if we haven't, it's what we have to have finished before things get difficult. But we certainly have to have started. We need to have made the psychological shift and to have started to build something different. Because once you've got something underway, it can grow, because you've got the relationships of trust that are the foundation you need. So under those circumstances, you can continue to prepare even as things start to get difficult. But if you haven't started at all when things get difficult, then you have a much, much bigger hill to climb.
Nicole, just two more. One here, then next one there.
Hi Nicole, thanks for your talk. I'm just really curious, you've moved from England to Canada. I just want to know what you're doing for you and your family. How are you future-proofing yourself?
Well, I left England in 2000 because it had, even then, a massive property bubble, which was very, very obvious, and went to Canada, where, for what I sold my townhouse in Kenilworth for, I could buy a 40-acre farm with 7 barns. and for half the money, and therefore have no debt. So the point was to end up in a situation where I had productive capacity, land, and no debt on it. And there was enough left over from selling the property in England to be able to put in some renewable energy infrastructure as well, which I would never have been able to do in England. There was no self-sufficiency potential in the property that I had where I was living, so I wouldn't have had any control of the essentials of the existence. Everything was tied up in the house. You know, no spare money to really do much of anything with it all. So it was a question of move to somewhere very much cheaper. And I had family there because I grew up there myself. So that's why in Canada, not for any other particular reason, just because it was cheap and I had family there. But we have 3 kilowatts of solar panels in the back field. We have a battery bank in the basement that runs the essential loads 24 hours a day. The batteries can be charged with the mains, with the solar panels, with a gasoline generator, or with a diesel generator run by the tractor. There's a solar domestic hot water system on the roof that provides all the hot water in the summer. There's an outdoor wood-burning furnace, a boiler with a water jacket that provides the space heating and the hot water in the winter. So there's no gas or oil requirement for heating or anything like that, or for hot water. So we provide our own electricity. The essential loads are things like the sump pump to keep the basement from flooding, the water pump so that we can still provide water because it's quite a rural area. A little circulating pump for the septic system, circulating pumps for the outdoor wood furnace, and for the solar domestic hot water, fridge, freezer, security system, invisible fence to keep my dogs from engaging in unauthorized hunting expeditions in my barn, and various things like that. So we learn to grow vegetables, we raise sheep, alpacas, chickens, and sled dogs, and we race sled dogs. So the means of getting around even when there's 5 feet of snow on the ground and nobody's clearing it up anymore. So there are quite a lot of things that were done there, a lot of thought that went into setting up that system. And it's my daughter's farm now, so she owns it and she's running it. So I'm a gypsy these days. I'm all over the world all the time, but I set something up for my family, and that is where they're based.
Hello, Ian Burkett, my name. Just following on from that, for people considering buying a property, and particularly one that's in that sort of transitional area where you have sustainable growth, but need to borrow some money to do that, you're saying basically from now to wait, that in Tasmania I notice now that there is a significant drop in the prices already of the property. Is that part of what you're talking is coming now already?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. The bubble is already bursting. So, I mean, where I was in Western Australia, where there's been a lot of price support because of the mining industry, and the place that we were staying in had been valued at over $1 million, and now it's been on the market for considerably less than that and hasn't sold for a long time. So, it's already happening. We're in that phase where the market is becoming increasingly illiquid, and we're going to start to see property prices come down. So you could sit in the sidelines in cash and wait for property prices to come down to what you can afford, or you could pool resources with other people, which probably makes more sense. If you have friends and family that you could do this with, then together you may be able to do something with no debt, where you'll be able to work it jointly as well. And that's going to be very important because it's very hard to do something like that by yourself. If there's just a nuclear family living in a place, trying to do anything in the way of achieving genuine self-sufficiency is really hard. If you have, say, 4 families or 6, you can possibly end up with a property that is really productive, that has a lot of potential. And yes, people don't have as much privacy as they might ideally have wanted. They don't have as much space as they might have wanted. But we can't have what we can't have. And if we're prepared to say, we need to redefine downwards the amount of space that we have and privacy that we actually need, and we're prepared to live in a more kind of communal structure, then we're looking after each other in a very fundamental way, and it allows something to be affordable through pooling resources that would never be affordable at the moment otherwise. It's do that and be able to do it now, or sit on the sidelines in cash and wait till prices come down. But if you do that, well, liquidity can be as hard to hang on to as it sounds, for one thing. But also, if you then buy a farm or something in a few years' time, you end up with perhaps not very much time to learn how to be a farmer. So learning curve time is really, really useful. So if you can do it sooner rather than later, even if you have to do it with pooling resources, then you can do it sooner, and you can start learning how to use the assets that you just managed to purchase. So that can be really, really useful. Other than that, if you're going to have to wait, then you might want to try learning the skills in advance by working on somebody else's land in the meantime. Because there are ways to learn, to do your learning curve on somebody else's property without having to own it yourself. If at the moment you could only do it by taking on a lot of debt. Problem with taking on the debt, of course, is that you just end up with the risk that the property values will fall, you'll be underwater, you get foreclosed on, it gets taken away anyway. And that's going to be a big risk. Plus, mortgages are recourse loans here. So if you end up in a state of foreclosure and it sells for less than you owe, they will come after you for the difference. Whereas in the States, that wouldn't happen. You could just send back the keys, and it's the bank's problem, not yours. Or not everywhere in the States, but a lot of places. But here, you're much more under the thumb if something goes wrong. So be very careful about debt, because the interest rates will go up, property taxes will go up, your ability to earn a living will go down, and you can get really squeezed, especially when the asset price collapses as well.
And so, just adding to that, when you're saying the economies go to deflation, yet the interest rates go up,
interest rates are a risk premium. So interest rates rise if the risk of repayment goes a lot higher. So people think that high interest rates are what happens in a period of inflation, but really that's not the case. And interest rates can rise, well, they'll rise in nominal terms, but the really dangerous point is that in real terms they rise even more, because the real rate of interest is the nominal rate minus the rate of inflation. Now, if inflation is positive, say you had nominal rate of 5% and inflation is 2%, well, the real rate of interest is 3%. So you subtract those numbers in inflationary times. So in inflationary times, the real rate is lower than the nominal rate. In deflationary times, in other words, inflation is negative, the nominal rate minus negative inflation means you add those numbers instead of subtracting them. So the real rate will be higher all the time, both on savings if the bank doesn't collapse and on debt. So the burden of interest rates is much higher than it actually appears to be under circumstances when real rates are very high.
Yeah, thank you for that. And very lastly, the thing I keep hearing quietly about is the printing of money in America and in parts of Europe, which usually leads to inflation, hyperinflation.
Well, they're not printing money. They're not printing real physical cash. So they're not looking at a currency hyperinflation. What they're doing is quantitative easing, which is doing their absolute best to continue pumping up a credit expansion that is dying. So what they're doing is putting money into the banking system, bailing out the banks, on the assumption that that money will then go through the magic engine of fractional reserve banking and will get expanded and will keep the expansion going. But it's not. What's happening is the banks are then taking that money and putting it back on deposit at the Federal Reserve. So it's not getting out into the economy at all. It's the engine of fractional reserve banking is breaking down. So is securitization. All the kinds of mechanisms for increasing the money supply, pumping up the supply of credit, are breaking down. And you don't have willing borrowers and lenders anymore, because the borrowers are maxed out and the lenders are saying, no way, we're not lending you, we don't think you're going to pay us back. In the days when you have securitization, they don't care because they're only going to sell the risk onto Wall Street anyway. But when you can't do that anymore, and the bank will be taking the risk and holding it on its own books, they're going to be really, really careful about what risks they take. So you don't have willing borrowers and lenders anymore, so you don't have the ability to pump up a credit expansion. It really is game over for the credit Ponzi scheme. And quantitative easing, I mean, you look at the numbers, they look really large, but they're not. In comparison to the outstanding debt, they are trivial. So what they've done, they're trying to say it's a lot. They're trying to make people believe it's a lot. But it's actually not. It's not paying back more than a tiny percentage of the amount of debt in the system. And if you look in Europe, it's even worse. The amount of bad debt in Europe alone is a large multiple of all the wealth in the entire world, a large multiple of global GDP. It's completely past the point of no return. So the risk of somehow igniting a hyperinflation through trivial amounts of quantitative easing, that risk really doesn't exist at this point. Now, what may happen down the line is if you disrupt the international debt financing model to the point where you break the power of the bond market, so nobody's lending money across borders anymore anyway, then you no longer have a constraint against printing real physical currency. And at that point, governments will do exactly that. But that is years away, because right now the bond market is extremely powerful. Governments are debt junkies. They cannot bite the hand that feeds them, so they have to keep the bond market sweet for as long as they possibly can. And when they can't, as is currently Greece is teetering on the brink of that right now, when they can't, then someone like Greece is going to go back to new drachmas and print them like there's no tomorrow, because they can't borrow money from abroad anyway, so there's nothing they can do. Anyone who still can borrow money abroad, that comes with a price in that the bond market will keep a lid on the extent to which you can actually print money. So I think hyperinflation is a risk in the longer term when you've broken the international debt financing model. So what we live through is deflation first, the elimination of excess claims to underlying real wealth, the crash in the value of credit. You live through that first, and then over a period of several years of upheaval, if you break the power of the bond market, then governments will print. So you can go from deflation into a period of currency hyperinflation further down the line. But that really is several years away. It could easily be 10 years away before we see a currency hyperinflation. So when people get very hung up on hyperinflation as a short-term risk, really the way I put that in context is to say, no, that's the risk on the horizon out there. And if you're keeping your eyes on the horizon, then you're quite likely to be walking along and you miss the big pit with the sharpened stakes in the bottom that's right in front of where you're about to put your feet. And so you really have to look at what things are coming up sooner rather than later. So I think it's deflation now, and the risk of hyperinflation is a much longer term one.
Sharp correction in your thinking.
I'm going to have to cut it off here.
Yes.
I believe Nicole is going to New Sydney. Just to park your...
If people would like to have a nice informal conversation over a bit of refreshment, that would be lovely. So
we'll invite you.
Everyone can come if they want, and we can talk some more.
So thank you all very much for coming.